Thank you, Jackson, and thank you, John. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to participate in the Hopemont lecture series. And I would like also to thank a number of people who have helped me with this research on Benjamin Gratz and the history of Lexington. I know Shea Brown from the Fayette County Records Office is right here in the front row. I've had the chance to benefit from the advice and the help of librarians at the Transylvania University Special Collections Department and UK's Special Collections and the Kentucky Room at the Lexington Public Library and also the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati has played an important role in my work, and none of what I'm going to tell you would have been possible without the assistance these folks have given me. This is undoubtedly the largest gathering of people interested in Benjamin Gratz since his funeral in March of 1884. At the time of his death, Benjamin Gratz was undoubtedly one of the best-known citizens of Lexington. In the almost 150 years since his death, what's left of his memory really is the name of Gratz Park. And if you go to the Visitors Bureau in Lexington and get their brochure on historic Lexington, it will tell you that Gratz Park is one of the first things you should see, but it won't tell you very much about the man for whom the park is named. The brochure says he's an early resident, a successful hemp manufacturer. The tranquil atmosphere of Gratz Park and the bland captions on its historical markers mask a complicated history that even few residents of Lexington know. The man whose name the park bears was no ordinary lawyer and businessman. A son of one of early America's most prominent Jewish families, Benjamin Gratz moved to Lexington in 1819 and quickly became a leading member of the city's educated and wealthy elite, which was a remarkable achievement in view of the fact that he was Lexington's first and for many years its only Jewish resident. His presence was proof of the willingness of Kentucky to accept religious diversity, and his Jewish identity put him in the middle of a major religious controversy in the 1820s that determined the fate of Transylvania University, then the most important educational institution west of the Appalachian Mountains. In addition to serving for 61 years as a member of the Board of Trustees of Transylvania University, Gratz was an active participant in almost every other aspect of Lexington's civic and political life. At various times, he was a member of the city council, a trustee of institutions including the public library, the city orphanage, the city cemetery, and the lunatic asylum, as it was then called. He was a member of the volunteer fire department. He was the first president of the County Fair Association, and he was one of the founders of the local historical society. He was a longtime supporter of the Whig Party, and particularly of his friend Henry Clay. He served as a pallbearer at Clay's funeral in 1852 and chaired the fundraising campaign to raise the money for the Henry Clay Monument that still stands in Lexington Cemetery. He was on the board of directors of numerous area banks and companies, including companies founded to build the first paved roads and railroads connecting Lexington to the rest of the region. One could hardly find a better exemplar of what Alexis de Tocqueville, who visited America at the beginning of the 1830s when Gratz was consolidating his position in Lexington, defined as the key characteristic of American democracy, the thing that made America special, the willingness of citizens to voluntarily take on the responsibilities that were fulfilled in Europe by governments and established churches. What goes unmentioned in references to Gratz's role in Lexington's 19th century history is the source of the wealth that allowed him to play the role in civic affairs that eventually led to the naming of Lexington's Gratz Park in his honor. In addition to his other distinctions, Benjamin Gratz was one of Lexington's largest slave owners. A block from the handsome house he purchased 5 years after settling in Lexington, and which still stands on Mill Street in Gratz Park, was another even larger and more impressive structure, the factory in which dozens of enslaved black laborers converted the hemp that was central Kentucky's leading cash crop prior to the Civil War into rope for sailing ships and bagging for the cotton grown on plantations further south. The genteel life that Gratz and his family led was made possible by their numerous enslaved household servants. The story of Benjamin Gratz's life in Lexington illustrates the divided soul of the city that called itself the Athens of the West. On the one hand, a willingness to welcome a member of what had long been a marginalized religious minority and to even elevate him to membership in the community's elite, and on the other hand, a willingness of a cultivated Jewish gentleman who had been born in Pennsylvania, the first American state to abolish slavery, to not only adapt himself to Southern institutions, but to actively exploit the opportunities that they provided and to defend them against challenges. So let me start by saying a little bit about Benjamin Gratz's origins and background. Benjamin Gratz was the last child of one of the most prominent American Jewish families of the Revolutionary era. His father, Michael Gratz, had immigrated to Philadelphia in 1759 from Germany. Together with his older brother Barnard, he became a successful merchant and also acquired numerous land claims in unsettled parts of the continent. The Gratz brothers enthusiastically supported the American Revolutionary cause, and they acted as what we could call court Jews to the Continental Congress, arranging supplies for the army and even making personal loans to some of the Congress's delegates. Benjamin Gratz grew up in a devout Jewish household in which daily prayers were recited morn and night. His father, his uncle, and his older brothers were active members of Philadelphia's first Jewish synagogue, the Mikveh Israel congregation. His older sister, Rebecca, born in 1781, became the most famous American Jewish woman of the 19th century. After the death of their parents, she kept the family together through her voluminous correspondence and frequent visits to relatives, including several visits to Lexington. Her letters to Benjamin and his wives and the replies they sent her are a major source of information about their lives. When I thank the various librarians and archivists who have helped me, I should have mentioned that I owe more to Rebecca Gratz probably and to Benjamin Gratz's two wives than anybody else for information about him. Benjamin Gratz's childhood was shadowed by a family tragedy. In 1794, when he was only 2 years old, his father, Michael, suffered an incapacitating stroke that left him deeply depressed. Michael Gratz lingered until 1811, but the atmosphere in the Gratz home cannot have been a cheerful one. At the age of 8, Benjamin and his older sister Sarah were sent to live with relatives in Baltimore. He returned to Philadelphia to attend the University of Pennsylvania and then studied law. In 1814, he served as a lieutenant in the Washington Guards, a unit in the Pennsylvania militia serving in the War of 1812. His military service gave him a network of contacts that would later help him integrate himself into Lexington society, where many of the most prominent local citizens had also fought in the war. After the war ended, young Benjamin began to take a part in the family's far-flung business affairs. During a stay in Washington, D.C. in 1816, he was urged by his brother Jacob to seek out contacts who might be helpful in validating the Gratz's extensive land claims in the West, and particularly to introduce himself to two influential Lexingtonians, the politician Henry Clay and the war hero and hemp manufacturer James Morrison, for whom Transylvania University's Morrison Hall is named. Gratz could probably get access to these men because the Gratz family name was already well known in Kentucky by this time. Michael Gratz, his father, had purchased land in Fayette County at least as early as 1784. Michael Gratz probably never visited Kentucky, but his two oldest sons, Simon and Hyman, and you can see here, owned property in Lexington and many other parts of the state. Hyman and a partner acquired Mammoth Cave in 1811 and exploited it as a saltpeter mine during the War of 1812. Among the Kentuckians who knew the Gratzes was Charles Scott, elected governor of the state in 1808. It may be through this connection that Scott's stepdaughter, Maria Gist, first made the acquaintance of Benjamin, her future husband. We know that she and her mother visited the Gratz family in Philadelphia before Benjamin came out here. At any rate, when Benjamin ventured out to the west in 1818, his family was already aware of his interest in the woman his brother Joseph called the lovely Maria. His sister Rebecca even shared information about one of Maria's other suitors in one of her letters to her brother. From a business point of view, moving to Kentucky in 1818, when Benjamin Gratz first came to the West, might not have appeared as a promising opportunity. Gratz's letters to his brothers in the early months of his stay in the West were all about the financial crisis gripping the region, with local banks teetering on the brink of bankruptcy and local landowners at risk of losing their properties. His sister Rebecca hoped that he would not make the mistake that other young men had made of settling in some small town like Lexington and, as she put it, waiting till it should grow into a populous city and seeing themselves great proprietors of lots and the wealth of ages. But Benjamin was concerned about something else. On the 24th of November, 1819, he and Maria Gist were married in Clark County, where her mother owned a large farm, and the young couple settled in Lexington. Although she was initially dismayed by her brother's decision to marry out of the Jewish faith, Rebecca Gratz quickly established a lively epistolary friendship with Maria, assuring her new sister-in-law that, quote, henceforth we will not remember that there is a difference of opinion on any subject between us. Under the circumstances when he decided to live here, Gratz could not have hoped to be much of a practicing Jew. There is no evidence of other Jews living in Lexington until at least the 1850s. Although a number of his children were named after members of his family, including sons Hyman and Bernard, in honor of his uncle Barnard, and daughter Miriam after his mother, they were baptized in the Episcopal Church to which Maria Gist belonged, and those who died young were buried in the church's graveyard. The presence of a Jew in Lexington did have one important consequence early in Gratz's life here, however. Shortly before Gratz's arrival in Kentucky, that's the, that's, of course, the Gratz house that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and it stood, of course, on what was then called the college lot, the property that the original building of Transylvania University had been on, and that is now Gratz Park. Shortly before Gratz's arrival in Kentucky, another immigrant from the East had come to Lexington, Horace Holly, a charismatic young minister hired as the president of the local college, Transylvania University, in 1818. To Lexington's urban elite at that point, Transylvania was the key to the city's future. Recognizing that Lexington was rapidly losing economic ground to rivals like Cincinnati and Louisville, the city's leaders adopted a strategy of emphasizing its cultural assets. Holly was hired with a mandate to make Transylvania the equal of the best colleges in the East, and within a few years he seemed well on the way to achieving that goal. The Holly and Gratz families, both headed by educated newcomers from the East and with small children of the same age, soon became close friends. Meanwhile, Gratz had also moved into Lexington's business elite. At first, he acted like a merchant, advertising that he could provide tea, coffee, nutmeg, and other exotic luxuries for sale. But in 1822, 3 years after he moved here, he entered into a partnership with the long-established James Morrison and John Bruce to run a hemp manufactory. Gratz and Morrison each put up $10,000, a considerable sum at the time. It was 3 times as much as Gratz had spent to buy his elegant house on Gratz Park, and Bruce invested $5,000. The elderly Morrison died in 1823, and Gratz and Bruce continued the partnership. In 1824, he purchased the house at 231 Mill Street, and Transylvania University's building at that point was just across the street from him, with President Holly's residence just behind it. In addition to taking over the deceased James Morrison's place as a hemp manufacturer, Gratz replaced Morrison on Transylvania University's Board of Trustees, beginning that term that would last until his death in 1884. No doubt Gratz was an attractive candidate for the board because of his wealth, but Horace Holly apparently sensed another possibility connected with Gratz's appointment. In April 1824, Holly announced with considerable fanfare, and it was published in all the area newspapers and even in newspapers in other states, that Transylvania was adopting a new policy on religious instruction and worship. Because, Holly wrote, because the university's trustees now included what he called a representation of the ancient Church of God under the Old Covenant, an obvious reference to Gratz, Transylvania was now in a position to embark on what Holly called an experiment, now to be made in earnest and under circumstances which warrant no small degree of confidence in its success, to ascertain how far the professed believers of the Bible and worshipers of God, though they are known by different names and associations, can harmonize in the management of the great interests of education as connected with the most important and practical truths and duties of religion. Then, as now, university administrators had a language all their own. In concrete terms, the representatives of all the religious denominations established in Lexington were invited to take turns leading the weekly chapel service for the students, provided that they limited themselves to preaching only, quote, the great doctrines of our common religion, those in which the good and pious of all denominations agree, without opening the door for polemical and sectarian divinity to enter. Having made this announcement, Holly took off on a visit to the East Coast, where, among other things, he attended services at Philadelphia's Mikveh Israel Synagogue as a guest of Gratz's brother Joseph. In a letter to his wife, Holly described the ancient Church of God in action. The women sit above and the men below. The worship is conducted in Hebrew, though the manuals of the congregation have translations of the service. Sometimes, though not frequently, the priest delivers at the request of some persons moral lectures in English. Transylvania's religious diversity policy represented a revolutionary step in American religious life. The insistence that sermons preached to the students put forward only doctrines acceptable to Jews as well as Christians challenged central dogmas of the Christian churches, particularly the teaching of the divinity of Christ. Local clergy in Lexington, especially the representatives of the Presbyterian Church, had already for many years been voicing their suspicions that the charismatic Horace Holly was a Socinian, Unitarian who did not believe in the divinity of Jesus, and the publication of his program for the university chapel seemed to prove their case. A violent campaign against him was unleashed in the local press. Hawley's ouster resulting from this controversy effectively killed the hope that Transylvania could elevate itself to the level of America's most reputable universities. It seems like a sad irony that Hawley's effort to recognize the ancient Church of God turned out to scuttle his larger plan for the school. Although Hawley failed to implant his vision of religious toleration on the Transylvania campus, he does seem to have made at least one convert in Lexington. In an undated letter to her mother, Maria Gratz patiently explained why she no longer believed in the doctrine of the Trinity, or, for that matter, in the teaching that Eve was responsible for original sin. Curiously, none of the venom directed at Hawley seems to have spilled over onto Benjamin Gratz. He remained a member of Transylvania's Board of Trustees even after the college officially affiliated first with the Presbyterian Church and later with the Methodists, and he attended at least one of the Methodist Church's state conventions as a representative of the college. Horace Hawley's ill-fated religious diversity proposal was the most visible instance of the impact that the presence of a resident Jew made in Lexington. Gratz himself does not seem to have done anything to encourage other Jews to settle here. The much poorer German Jewish immigrants who began arriving in towns along the Ohio River after 1830 were of a totally different social class from Gratz. As Cincinnati Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise commented at the time of Gratz's death, he moved in circles in which young German Jews could not easily gain admission. According to the 19th century historian of Lexington, George Rank, the first observance of Yom Kippur in Lexington took place in 1864. It was probably organized by Union soldiers who were then stationed in the city. Moses Kaufman, who became the most visible Jewish resident in Lexington in the last decades of the 19th and the early 20th century, arrived in Cincinnati in the 1850s as one of those German Jews, but only moved to Lexington in 1867. Kaufman helped found the earliest formal Jewish organization in the city, the Burial Society, in 1872. We have only occasional glimpses of Gratz's own relationship with Jewish customs during the years he lived here. In 1837, Rebecca Gratz wrote that she was pleased to hear that her brother had built a sukkah. This is a little roofless booth or tabernacle that observant Jewish families build in honor of the fall holiday of Sukkot, and Gratz may have thought that his children, he had quite a number of young children at that point, would be amused by eating outside for a week in the booth in their backyard. In 1871, we have an interesting mention of Gratz and Jewish practices, but somebody whose name you will all recognize, George Armstrong Custer, who was stationed here in Lexington in 1871. He was a cavalry officer. He was assigned here to buy horses for the United States Army. He would later ride one of them to his death at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. But while he was here, he visited a farm Gratz owned in Woodford County, where he observed a cow being slaughtered according to kosher ritual practices. It's hardly likely that Gratz himself cared about consuming kosher meat. He had lived in Lexington for at least 30 years when he couldn't possibly have obtained any, but he may have been accommodating some of the other Jews who had by that time settled in Lexington. The only occasion on which Gratz went out of his way to impress his fellow Lexingtonians with his devotion to Judaism was his funeral in 1884. Not only had Gratz instructed his family to see that he was given a proper Jewish religious ceremony, but he had directed them to contact Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, the founder of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and the leader of the Reform movement in American Judaism, and one of the most important Jewish figures in American life, to come down to Lexington for the occasion. The late residence of Benjamin Gratz, deceased, was crowded to suffocation yesterday at 3:00 p.m. to witness the funeral services by Dr. Wise of Cincinnati, the leading Jewish rabbi of the country, a local newspaper reported. Dr. Wise came in at 3 o'clock sharp and was conducted to the room where the remains lay. He took a small book from his pocket and read the Jewish ceremony, most of which was in English. After reading the ceremony, he made a few remarks in reference to the life and character of the deceased. He spoke of the deceased having requested on his deathbed to have the Jewish ceremony read, which proved that he respected and held sacred the teachings of his parents, especially after he had neglected for many years the Jewish customs. Rabbi Wise was not entirely amused on this occasion. In conclusion, Dr. Wise said that as the deceased had requested, he would, according to the Portuguese custom, the most old-fashioned and rigid version of Jewish practice, walk around the coffin 3 times, which he did, and repeated in Hebrew as he walked different quotations or sayings, which he translated separately. Wise himself wrote an article about the funeral in his own newspaper, The American Israelite, and drew an edifying lesson from the fact that Gratz, even though he had not lived a Jewish life, had wanted a Jewish funeral. It is a rare case that any Jew does not express this wish at the end of his days, however estranged he may have been to Israel's cause and mission. The large turnout for Gratz's funeral and the respectful tone in which the press reported on it show that he had indeed set a precedent for the acceptance of Jews in Lexington. As more Jews settled in the city after the Civil War, expressions of anti-Semitism did become more common, but they did not prevent store owners such as Moses Kaufman, who you see here on the left, from creating the basis for a small community. By 1877, when Gratz was still alive, Kaufman served as the Jewish community's self-appointed spokesman, and he could write, "The Israelites of this place stand as high in the estimation of the community as any in the world. They control a large share of the business done here and are safe, enterprising, and prudent businessmen." Local newspapers occasionally published caricatures of Kaufman, like this one, showing him with stereotypically Jewish features, but they also announced the high holy day services that were being held regularly in the city from the late 1870s onward, and they gave Kaufman himself space to answer criticisms of Jews and Judaism. In 1879, apparently unaware that Benjamin Gratz had been a councilman 40 years earlier, Kaufman was elected to the city council and served for a number of years and then held a number of other city officers. By the time of Gratz's death, his son Howard had converted the open space in front of his house into what was already familiarly referred to as Gratz Park, which eventually became Lexington's first historical district. For more than half a century, the highlight of the Gratz Park Historical District was what was then called the Hunt Morgan House, housing a museum honoring one of Gratz's neighbors, John Hunt Morgan, the Thunderbolt of the Confederacy. In recent years, growing awareness of the centrality of slavery to Lexington's pre-Civil War history has led to the Hunt Morgan House being given back its original name, Hopemont, and it now features displays that discuss the role of slavery in the hemp industry on which early Lexington's fortunes were based. The Gratz House, like the other properties surrounding Gratz Park, is a private residence, and Benjamin Gratz's connection with slavery has not received any significant public attention. That connection forms the shadow side of Gratz's contribution to Lexington's civic culture. However, like his neighbors, the Morgans, Gratz was intimately involved with slavery. Not only did the income that enabled him to become a civic leader come from the exploitation of enslaved laborers in his hemp factory, but until the Civil War, every aspect of Gratz's daily life involved interactions with enslaved black people. It is quite probable that for most of Gratz's time in Lexington, the black servants living in his house or its outbuildings outnumbered the white members of his family. Family documents, particularly letters from his first wife, Maria Gratz, make it possible to glimpse the details of these interactions at a level of detail perhaps unequaled for any other household in Lexington at the time. Benjamin Gratz grew up in Philadelphia. He was born 12 years after the state passed its pioneering law starting to abolish slavery in 1780. That did not mean, however, that the institution would have been unfamiliar to him when he arrived in Lexington. Pennsylvania's law called for a gradual phasing out of slavery. Children born to women who were enslaved at the time of the law's passage were to remain enslaved to their mother's masters until they reached the age of 28. There were thus many enslaved black people in Philadelphia during Gratz's childhood, and indeed his own father, Michael, purchased a new enslaved servant in 1782, 2 years after the passage of the 1780 law. When Gratz went to live with relatives in Baltimore at the age of 8, he found himself in a state where slavery remained legal until the end of the Civil War. Benjamin Gratz probably acquired enslaved domestics in Kentucky as soon as he married Maria Gist, although she had expressed her opposition to the sale of slaves in a letter written a year before their marriage. The only published study of Gratz and slavery to date claims that he, quote, never saw profit-making benefit in owning slaves, and maintains that he preferred hiring servants rather than owning them, but numerous documents prove otherwise. I show this woodcut, by the way. It has nothing to do with Gratz, but I believe it may be the earliest visual representation of an African-American person in Lexington. It dates from 1807, from the autobiography of John Robert Shaw, the well digger who was responsible for the digging of most of the first wells in the city of Lexington in its early years, including the one that stood in Gratz Park, and which the Gratz family may well have used to draw its water from. Slavery was, of course, a well-established institution in Kentucky. When Gratz moved here, he was in no sense the architect of the slave system here. When he became involved with the hemp industry, he became involved with an industry that was completely dependent on enslaved labor for the growing of hemp, for its processing, and for turning it into rope and bagging, which was what he was involved with. An 1823 document in the Fayette County Public Records Office. And when Gratz became partners with Morrison and Bruce in 1822, he became legal part owner of the enslaved laborers in their hemp factory. The partnership agreement specified that, quote, at the expiration of said co-partnership, the Negroes shall be equally divided between said Morrison, Bruce, and Gratz. After Morrison's death a year later, Gratz and Bruce signed a document acknowledging the debt they owed to the Morrison estate, which named 38 enslaved blacks belonging to the enterprise. That's the document up on the screen here that is in the Fayette County Public Records Office. In the 1830 National Census, the Gratz-Bruce partnership was recorded as owning 75 enslaved laborers. When Gratz and Bruce renewed their partnership in 1832, Bruce took responsibility for the direct supervision of the firm's laborers, but Gratz remained legal co-owner of them and was entitled to half of them when the agreement ended. An 1836 newspaper article described the factory complex in which these enslaved people worked. A calendar and hemp house that could hold 60 tons of hemp, a hackling house, a two-story factory 195 feet long and 25 feet wide, a weaving house, a two-story hemp house, a spinning house measuring 180 feet by 30 feet, and a 600-foot rope walk in which enslaved laborers would have trudged back and forth, stretching the twisted hemp fibers into cables to make rope. So this was a major enterprise, a really big factory complex. By 1850, by which time Bruce had died, the census listed 65 enslaved people belonging to Gratz, presumably including both those employed in the rope works and his domestic servants. This made him the second largest slave owner in Fayette County at that time. The 1860 census showed only 10 or 12, depending on how one reads the document, enslaved people under Gratz's name. He had apparently retired from the rope-making business in 1851, to judge from one of Rebecca Gratz's letters. But there is certainly no doubt that Gratz derived a considerable portion of his income from the toil of the enslaved workers in his factory. Aside from their numbers and the names listed in the 1823 mortgage document, little can be said about Gratz's relationship with the enslaved workers in the factory. It is possible that they were housed in the factory itself. The 1832 partnership agreement made Bruce responsible for, quote, the cooking and washing for the Negroes employed. But there were also numerous enslaved black people living in the Gratz home. When Maria Gratz's mother was coming to visit in 1832, Maria embarked on a long discussion of the arrangements that could be made to accommodate her, assuring her that, quote, you need bring only your maid, or if you prefer it, none, and I will see that you are well waited on by Millie or Matilda or Mama, as you prefer. A few months later, she told her mother that Benjamin had purchased a young black man named Henry for her. His master was compelled to part with him for debt for $300. He has a very good character. Simon, our boy, knew him at Winters and says they thought very highly of him. Although the boy is only 15 years old, he is able to do your work and will improve daily in strength and age. In another letter written around the same time, Maria told her mother, I do not know what is the matter with Charles. I had to threaten him with a whipping. In early 1834, Rebecca Gratz wrote to her sister-in-law welcoming the news that her brother had purchased an enslaved woman and her daughter, perhaps to keep them from being sold down the river into the cotton fields of the deep south. I wept for joy that I have such a brother as your dear husband to buy that afflicted mother and daughter from the base servitude to which they were doomed, and my knowledge of his feelings and character made me anticipate the issue before I turned the page on which, with such sweet words, you record the act. I hope the poor blacks will prove worthy of his mercy and fit to supply some of your losses. The reference to losses may refer to the hecatomb in the Gratz household during the cholera epidemic of June-July 1833. The death lists published in the local newspaper indicate that 7 enslaved people died in the Gratz household: Moses, Lucy, Millie, Simon, Celie, Marshall, and Henry. In addition, 3 enslaved people listed as the property of the Gratz and Bruce firm fell victim to the disease. No other family in Lexington reported more than 3 deaths among its enslaved servants, an indication of the large size of the Gratz's domestic staff. A letter Maria Gratz wrote shortly before her death in 1841 takes us into the tangled relations between the Gratzes and their black servants with a rare level of intensity. And I must say that after I read this letter, I couldn't sleep that night thinking about it, so I warn you. This letter was addressed to her teenage son, Howard, who at that point had been sent to school in Pennsylvania. Maria began by cheerfully telling Howard that her husband was having a new outbuilding put up on their property to house their black servants. You will now ask where we put our servants in the meantimes. Why, your father rents the house just above us for their accommodations, and they say they are comfortable and much pleased with hope of new and handsome apartments. Every one of them desire to be kindly presented to you. The final paragraph of the same letter was in a very different tone, however. I know, dear son, you thought well of my maid Nanny and have found fault with me for thinking better of Amarita than of her. Oh, Howard, Nancy has treated me so badly. She had a child unknown to me. She kept it alive about a day and 2 nights. It died. She buried it herself in the night, and I knew not a word of it until someone came from the farm to let me know. She locked her door every night for several weeks, not permitting Amarita to sleep there, and then did that horrid deed that makes my blood creep to think of. I was so fearful lest she should be taken up and tried for infanticide in our house that I made George take her to the farm. If the grand jury had been informed, what would I have done? You need make no mention of what I tell you, for I let no one know that I have written to you on the subject. Perhaps only a skilled novelist could do justice to the many questions raised by this letter. It reflects Maria Gratz's desire to see herself and her husband as good people who treated the blacks they enslaved well, and her willingness to believe that the family's servants truly had warm feelings for her son, whom some of them had undoubtedly helped raise. When one contemplates the enslaved woman Nancy's determination to keep her pregnancy secret, however, the question of the baby's paternity immediately arises. And Maria Gratz said that her son thought well of my maid. Is she hinting that he might have been the father? Could it have been Benjamin Gratz himself? Was Nancy's determination to do away with her child an expression of unwillingness to condemn it to a life of slavery? Or, if the baby's skin color would have betrayed white fatherhood, was Nancy afraid that Mrs. Gratz would blame her for allowing a member of her family to have his way with her? Did Maria Gratz want to hush the affair up to save Nancy from being punished for infanticide? Or was she more concerned about the damage to the family's reputation if Nancy had been arrested? In any event, it is clear that the elegant Gratz house had been the scene of a human drama as painful as any that the oppressive system of slavery could produce. Assuming that Maria Gratz's letter is truthful, and one can hardly imagine a mother inventing such a story to tell to her own son, this certainly makes us think differently about the lives the inhabitants of the elegant houses on Gratz Park led. In some cases, the Gratz's enslaved servants passed up what might have been opportunities to escape from servitude. Toward the end of 1841, when she was already severely ill, Maria Gratz and her son Carrie made a trip to Mammoth Cave, the property that had once belonged to Benjamin's brother Hyman. On the way, one of their horses broke down, and Mrs. Gratz sent her enslaved men, George and Monsey, back to Lexington on their own to get a replacement. It might have been a chance for them to escape, although to do so would have involved great risks. In 1848, two of the Gratz's enslaved men made a very different decision. They joined a group of 40 or more blacks who made a mass escape from Lexington. When they were cornered in Bracken County in northern Kentucky, they fought back, killing one of the white men trying to capture them. Two of the group, Jerry and Walker, belonged to Gratz. Since they were not accused of having been directly involved in the death of the white vigilante, Gratz petitioned the governor of Kentucky to pardon them. He may have had humanitarian motives, or he may have been concerned about losing the value of his property if the men were imprisoned. In his petition, he promised to have them removed out of the state, a fate that many enslaved blacks in Kentucky dreaded as much as any physical punishment that might be imposed on them. By the time of the 1848 mass escape, Maria Gist Gratz had died, and Gratz had married a second time to his first wife's niece, Anne Boswell Shelby. This second marriage certainly did not change the nature of the Gratz household with regard to slavery. Anne Gratz had enslaved people of her own, and her son Joseph, who was 14 when he entered the Gratz family, brought with him his own personal black servant, Billy Hunter, whom his mother had purchased for him when he was 11 for the extravagant price of $2,000. Exactly what Benjamin Gratz thought about the institution of slavery is difficult to say with certainty. Unlike his friend Henry Clay, Gratz does not seem to have written or said anything on the subject. In addition to exploiting slave labor at his factory and depending on enslaved servants in his home, however, he regularly took part in collective actions to maintain the institution. In 1832, for example, Gratz was elected to Lexington's first city council. His first committee assignment was to help in drawing up an ordinance specifying the duties of the night watchman, which included provisions such as the following: "Be it further ordained that the watchman shall apprehend all slaves found violating any of the ordinances of the city or laws of the state during the night, and detain them until next morning, when they shall be taken before the mayor and dealt with according to the law or the ordinance of the city. They shall also apprehend all free colored persons found in company with slaves at any unlawful assembly and take them to be before the mayor to be dealt with according to law. In 1844, 2 years after Transylvania University had officially put itself under the patronage of the Methodist Church, the university's president, Henry Bascom, who was also the outspokenly pro-slavery leader of the Southern faction within the church, asked the university's trustees to approve a resolution supporting his group and objecting to the Northern Methodists' quote, abolition sentiments and views, and to make it clear that, as it seemed imminent, the Methodist Church split into two geographically defined sections, the university would declare its loyalty to the Southern group. Gratz voted with his trustee colleagues to put the university on record as defending slavery. Gratz was directly and publicly involved in the defense of slavery again in 1845, when a Lexington abolitionist, Cassius Clay, had the audacity to start a newspaper advocating the ending of the institution. A citizens' committee was organized to shut Clay's paper down. A public meeting held at the Lexington courthouse on August 18, 1845, was chaired by Henry Clay's son James, with Benjamin Gratz serving as secretary. The meeting resolved that, quote, no abolitionist press ought to be tolerated in Kentucky, and none shall be in this city or its vicinity, and the more activist members of the group, apparently not including Gratz, then went to Clay's newspaper office, seized his printing equipment, and put it on a train to Cincinnati. Gratz or his wife must have reported the affair to Rebecca Gratz, whose response showed that she fully embraced the action in which her brother had participated. Is Mr. Clay insane that he should have attempted such a plan in Lexington, she wrote? He might surely have known trouble would ensue. By 1851, to judge by one of Rebecca Gratz's letters, Benjamin Gratz retired from hemp manufacturing, which meant that he no longer owned a significant number of enslaved laborers. Meanwhile, Kentucky and the country as a whole were lurching toward civil war. Despite his long involvement in slavery, there was never any doubt about Benjamin Gratz's loyalty to the Union. Rebecca, who was a very staunch Unionist, would have totally disowned him otherwise. Many Kentucky families were divided between Union and Confederate supporters, but few lived that division as more acutely than the Gratzes. Gratz's son, Cary, enlisted in the Union forces in Missouri and was killed in combat in August 1861. Cary's body arrived Tuesday evening and his funeral took place yesterday. Father was anxious that there should be no parade, but the Union men heard of it and determined to show their respect for his memory and their love for the cause in which he fell, and the old infantry and home guards turned out, and my darling was buried with all the military pomp possible, Miriam Gratz, a child of Benjamin Gratz's second marriage, wrote in her diary. Being a teenage girl, she couldn't help also noting in her diary how handsome the Union men officers were in their trousers with the red stripes down the side. Cary's brother Bernard also served in the Union Army and was credited with carrying a warning to Louisville in 1862 when Confederate forces were advancing on the city. Meanwhile, a third brother, Howard, although he stayed out of the fight, openly sympathized with the South. It vexes me that Howard should mix with the evil spirits which float about the communities while all he holds dear are dependent on the success of the government, Rebecca wrote to her sister-in-law. Anne Gratz probably wasn't pleased to get that letter. Joe Shelby, her son from her first marriage, who had lived in the Gratz house in the 1840s and become an integral part of the family, had joined the Confederate forces, where he eventually rose to the rank of general and became one of the diehards who fled to Mexico after 1865 rather than surrender. Even as she rejoiced over Union victories, Rebecca Gratz understood the effects of the division in her brother's household. It is hard to reconcile our conflicting feelings when so many with whom we have lived in bonds of love and are still so dear entertain opinions in which we cannot sympathize, although their destiny seems influenced by them, she wrote to Anne Gratz. When the Gratzes took Joe Shelby's wife into their household during the war, no less a personage than Abraham Lincoln became involved in the family's affairs. Show this to whom it may concern as your authority for allowing Mrs. Shelby to remain at your house so long as you choose to be responsible for what she may do, the president wrote to Benjamin Gratz. Rebecca Gratz worried about the arrangement. You have elements of so much evil in Howard's rebel activity that should he, through his wife and this young woman, form a league, I do not think your vigilance would avail, she wrote to Benjamin. When Confederate troops occupied Lexington briefly in the fall of 1862, a cavalry detachment camped in front of the Gratz's house. In spite of an order from their neighbor John Hunt Morgan to leave them alone, the diarist Frances Peter, another young woman who was living in one of the houses around Gratz Park, reported that some of the secesh troops forced their way into the Gratz residence. Gratz's daughter Miriam, quote, told them that they had an order from J. Morgan for the protection of their property, but the fellows said their horses were famishing, and as they were already in the stable proceeding to help themselves, Miss Gratz had to surrender with the best grace she could. Some 3 or 4 others came a short while afterward and made the servant tell them when supper would be ready, and at Mr. Gratz's supper hour they came stalking in, and Mr. G had to take them into the dining room and sit them down to his table. After the Confederates were ousted, the Union commander set up his headquarters in what is now the Bodley Bullock House at the southeast corner of Gratz Park. Gratz now had to run interference for Mrs. Morgan, who refused to conceal her sympathy for the rebels. The war and the looming end of slavery had many impacts on Gratz's life. Although they were still in servitude until 1865, the blacks living with families in Gratz Park freely expressed their hopes for a Union victory. On Christmas Eve in 1862, Gratz's hemp house and factory, which had been taken over as a storehouse by the Union Army, burned down. Gratz petitioned unsuccessfully for years for compensation for his loss. One of his heirs was still pursuing the case as late as 1903. In 1864, Thomas Berry, one of Gratz's enslaved men, gained his freedom by enlisting in the Union Army. Gratz promptly filed a claim for financial compensation, as the law allowed him to. Gratz did not express any overt opposition to the abolition of slavery, which took effect in Kentucky in mid-1865, and his wife wrote that, quote, "We retain all our servants but old Betsy, who said she wanted to go to her children in Frankfort. I thought we would have a great deal of trouble and have been agreeably disappointed." Gratz never forgot what emancipation had cost him, however. In the jottings about his financial affairs that he compiled for his executors during the 1870s, he made a laconic note: "Negro slave notes in pocketbook, no account closed, of no value being collected." By the time he compiled these notes, Benjamin Gratz was no longer a wealthy slaveholder, nor was he the only Jew in Lexington. Whereas Gratz seems to have done nothing much to publicize his Jewishness prior to his funeral in 1884, the Jews who settled in the city after the 1860s made themselves a visible presence. Local newspapers carried advertisements for Jewish-owned stores and covered the creation of the Jewish cemetery in 1872, and I've already mentioned Moses Kaufman, who wrote regularly for the papers. Meanwhile, the elderly and increasingly blind Benjamin Gratz became a community icon. A newspaper article in honor of Gratz's 90th birthday in 1882 read, "His nature, comeliness of manner, quiet, unobtrusive dignity, sincere but unostentatious friendship and spotless integrity of character have for these many years endeared him to all those who were honored by his acquaintance." Robert Peter, the author of The History of Fayette County, a major historical source published in 1882, wrote, "The old gentleman adheres to the faith of his forefathers, takes his daily walks amid physical darkness, and has a friendly greeting for all our friends, and as he has a retentive memory and a thorough appreciation of passing events, his conversation is particularly interesting." Gratz's death inspired a eulogy from Rosa Vertner Jeffrey, a local poetess who was also one of his neighbors in Gratz Park. "Whate'er thy creed or faith, within thy soul there surely was no dearth of charity, which he, we trust in faith, sees as the best of all on earth." Especially in contrast with the often lamented atmosphere of the Gilded Age, Gratz had become a symbol of a vanished Lexingtonian past. His involvement with slavery, like that of other members of the city's white community after the Civil War, went completely unmentioned. Aside from a small plaque now hidden in an office in the local Reformed temple, together with a teacup that once belonged to Gratz's mother, the only remaining trace of Gratz's contribution to Lexington is Gratz Park, the open space originally set aside in 1792 as the site of Transylvania University. Once the university moved to its current location north of 3rd Street in 1833, the fate of the property remained in limbo for many years. In 1876, Gratz's son, Howard Gratz, went to the university's Board of Trustees and offered to take over management of the property using his own money to pay for the erection of walks, stands, and benches, and a fence that would make it possible to restrict entry, as he explicitly said, to respectable white people. By excluding black people from Gratz Park, Howard Gratz helped define the space as a bastion of white gentility. Howard Gratz was not the only white Lexington resident actively at work at suppressing the memory of the role that the enslavement of blacks had played in the city's development. George Rank, the author of the first substantial history of Lexington, made virtually no mention of the presence of blacks or the existence of slavery in his book, published in 1872. 10 years later, Robert Peter, in his History of Fayette County, adopted a different strategy, arguing that it was necessary to counter the impression created by works such as Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Peter, who had himself owned enslaved household servants before the Civil War, freely admitted that, quote, "Without the labor of the Negro, this region would have made much slower progress in its settlement, and the character of its population would probably have been radically different. To Negro slavery, we are largely indebted for the chivalric character and open-handed hospitality of our fathers." His argument, however, was that enslaved blacks in Kentucky had been well treated. The slaves, with no cares pressing upon them, were the happiest people to be found in any community, he claimed. Now that they were free, in his jaundiced view, they look upon work as one of the relics of slavery and prefer anything almost to honest labor. Although Peter made no mention of Benjamin Gratz's involvement with slavery, he did, as I say, transform Gratz into a sort of icon of the Athens of the West, and he clearly understood that the connection between the chivalric character of Lexington's pre-Civil War white residents depended on the exploitation of black labor. As Robert Peter's depiction of Benjamin Gratz shows, Lexington's first Jewish resident provided his fellow citizens with an opportunity to recognize the positive contributions of a member of one minority group while retaining their prejudices against the members of another. Recovering the story of Benjamin Gratz's life in Lexington challenge us to ponder the significance of the fact that his name has been associated for a century and a half with a site of memory, Gratz Park, that plays a central role in forming the image of our city's early history. What we choose to do with that knowledge is an open question, but honesty requires us to acknowledge that if Benjamin Gratz had not been a major slaveholder, his name would not be attached to the open space between Market and Mill Streets. Thank you.